At the checkout line, I paid for an elderly stranger's groceries simply because her card was declined. I expected a nod or a smile, but instead she leaned in close, her grip tightening on my arm like a vice. She whispered, "When your son leaves tomorrow, do not touch the snow in your yard." I thought she was just a confused old woman until the next morning. When I looked out my window, what I saw buried under the white powder made my heart stop. My son had not just come to visit, he had come to bury me. Before I reveal the trap he set, let me know in the comments where you are watching from. If you have ever felt betrayed by your own flesh and blood, hit that like button and subscribe. The wind in Chicago that afternoon was sharp enough to cut glass. I stood inside the warmth of Whole Foods, shaking the snow off my coat. My name is Douglas Bennett, and at 74 years old, I have learned that money can buy comfort, but it cannot buy respect. I was standing in the express lane holding a basket with a single bottle of $80 Cabernet Sauvignon. It was a peace offering for a dinner my son Travis was attending later that night. The line was moving slowly. Directly in front of me stood a woman who looked like a strong gust of wind might blow her away. She wore a coat that had seen better decades, and her trembling hands were trying to slide an EBT card through the reader. The machine beeped that harsh rejection sound 3 times. The cashier, a young man with a nose ring and zero patience, sighed loudly. He announced to the whole store that she was short $42.50. The woman, whom I would later know as Vera, lowered her head. Her basket was heartbreaking. It was just store-brand soup cans and cheap cat food. Behind me, a man in a business suit checked his Rolex and groaned audibly. He muttered something about people needing to check their balance before holding up the line. The air was thick with judgment and cold indifference. I looked at my expensive wine and then at her cat food. The contrast made my stomach turn. I had spent my life as a structural engineer building skyscrapers that could withstand hurricanes, yet here was a woman crumbling under the weight of $40. I stepped forward and slid my platinum credit card into the machine. "Put it all on my tab," I told the cashier firmly. The boy looked at me surprised, and the businessman behind me fell silent. I did not wait for a thank you, and I did not preach about kindness. I just wanted the humiliation to end. I simply paid the bill and motioned for the cashier to start bagging. That small swipe of plastic was nothing to me, but I had no idea that this moment was the first domino in a chain of events that would save my life. We pushed through the sliding automatic doors, and the Chicago winter hit us like a physical blow. The wind howled across the asphalt, cutting through my heavy wool coat, as if it were made of paper. I steered the shopping cart toward the far end of the lot, where she pointed my leather gloves, gripping the freezing metal handle to keep it from veering off course. The snow was coming down harder now, transforming the world into a gray and white blur that stung the eyes. She walked with a surprising speed for her age, her head tucked low against the gale. I noticed her boots were worn down at the heels, offering little traction on the slick black ice hiding beneath the fresh powder. I wanted to ask her if she had enough heat at home or if she needed a ride, but something about her rigid posture screamed for silence. We reached a rusted sedan that looked like it had survived 3 different decades and lost the fight in all of them. The rear bumper was held on with duct tape, and the windows were frosted over with intricate patterns of neglect. I popped the trunk for her. It creaked loudly, protesting the cold, revealing a spare tire and a clutter of old newspapers. I began lifting the heavy bags of cat litter and canned soup, placing them carefully inside so they wouldn't slide around. I was just about to close the lid, ready to wish her a safe drive and return to my own comfortable life, when she turned to me. The transformation was instant. The frail, embarrassed woman who had bowed her head at the checkout line vanished completely. In her place was someone terrified and urgent. She reached out and grabbed my wrist. Her grip was shocking in its strength. I could feel her fingernails digging into my skin through the thick fabric of my coat and shirt, anchoring me to the spot. Her eyes, a watery blue surrounded by deep wrinkles, locked onto mine with an intensity that made me freeze. "Listen to me," she hissed, her voice barely rising above the wind, but carrying a weight that silenced the storm around us. I live in the attic apartment across the alley from you. I see everything. I pulled back slightly confused, thinking perhaps she was suffering from dementia or paranoia. But she yanked me closer, refusing to break contact. Last night at 3 in the morning, your son was in the yard. He was digging near the furnace vent. The words hung in the freezing air, making no sense. Digging, Travis. He had told me he was asleep in the guest room all night. She wasn't finished. She looked around the empty lot as if expecting to be watched. When he leaves tomorrow, do not touch the snow in the yard. Do not step out that back door. Promise me. It was not a request. It was a command born of absolute fear. Before I could ask a single question, she released me. The physical pain in my wrist faded, replaced by a cold knot of dread in my stomach. She scrambled into the driver's seat and slammed the door. The engine sputtered, coughed, and finally roared to life with a cloud of black smoke. I stood there, snow accumulating on my shoulders, watching her taillights fade into the whiteout. My mind raced to find a logical explanation. Maybe she was crazy. Maybe she was just a lonely old woman inventing drama to feel important. I tried to laugh it off, to tell myself that Travis was my son, my own flesh and blood, but as I walked back to my luxury SUV, the seed of doubt she planted began to take root. I remembered the red clay mud on Travis's boots this morning. I had dismissed it then, but now the memory chilled me more than the wind ever could. I unlocked my car, the expensive bottle of wine in my bag, suddenly feeling very heavy, like a stone around my neck. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, sealing out the wind, but the chill followed me inside. My home is a sprawling $1.8 million estate on the North Shore, a testament to 40 years of structural engineering and wise investments. It was designed to be a sanctuary, but as I stood in the foyer with melting snow dripping from my coat onto the marble floor, it felt more like a beautifully decorated tomb. The silence of the house was broken only by the shrill, performative voice of my daughter-in-law, Courtney. I walked into the living room, my boots heavy with exhaustion. Travis was sprawled across the Italian leather sofa, the one my late wife had picked out with such care. He didn't look up. He didn't ask why his 74-year-old father was soaking wet, or why I had been gone so long in a blizzard. He was too busy scrolling through his phone, his face illuminated by the blue light, looking bored and entitled. Courtney was positioned in front of a ring light she had set up near the fireplace. She was in the middle of a live stream, posing with a bright orange Hermes Birkin bag. I stared at the bag. I recognized it immediately, not because I follow fashion, but because I had seen the $12,000 charge on my American Express statement just 3 days ago. It was a supplementary card I had given her for emergencies. Apparently, in Courtney's world, lacking a designer purse for a ski trip constituted an emergency. "Hey guys," she chirped to her phone screen, flashing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just showing you this little treat I picked up. You have to spoil yourself sometimes, right? Hard work pays off." The audacity punched me in the gut, harder than the cold. Hard work. Courtney hadn't worked a day since she married my son. She was bragging about a trophy purchased with the sweat of my brow while I stood there shivering. She finally noticed me standing in the archway. She didn't mute the stream. She didn't rush over to take my coat. Instead, her face twisted into a mask of annoyance. "You are late, Dad," she snapped, her voice dropping the sweet influencer tone for the sharp edge she reserved for me. "Travis and I are starving. We have been waiting almost an hour." "Did you even stop to get the steaks? Or are we expected to order takeout like college students?" Travis finally looked up, tossing his phone onto the cushion. "Yeah, Dad. Seriously, we have an early flight tomorrow. We need to eat." I looked at them. Really looked at them. My son with his soft hands and expensive haircut, and his wife clutching a stolen bag like a shield. Not one question about my safety. Not one glance at my trembling hands. In that moment, the doubt that Vera had planted in my mind began to solidify into a terrifying certainty. They didn't see a father standing there. They saw an obstacle. They saw a wallet that breathed. I gripped the bottle of wine in my bag, fighting the urge to smash it against the wall. I forced a calm I did not feel and walked toward the kitchen, leaving a trail of wet footprints on the Persian rug that neither of them deserved to walk on. We sat down at the long mahogany dining table, a piece of furniture that had hosted Thanksgiving dinners and Christmas mornings for 30 years. Now it felt like a courtroom where I was the defendant, and the verdict had already been decided. The silence was only broken by the scrape of silverware against china. I watched Travis uncork the bottle of Cabernet I had bought. He poured it with a steady hand, but his eyes did not meet mine. They were fixed lower, staring intently at my left wrist. I was wearing my Rolex Submariner, a vintage piece I had bought to celebrate the completions of the Willis Tower renovation project back in the day. It was worth $40,000, give or take. The way Travis looked at it wasn't with admiration. It was with calculation. He was appraising it mentally, adding its value to whatever ledger he kept in his desperate mind. He slid the glass toward me and cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "So, Dad," he started, putting on his best salesman smile, the one that used to charm his mother but now just looked like a baring of teeth. "Courtney and I were thinking about heading up to Aspen tomorrow. Just for 3 days. A little getaway to clear our heads. The market has been brutal lately. Absolute bloodbath." I took a slow sip of the wine. It was excellent, full-bodied and rich, but it tasted like ash in my mouth. I didn't say anything. I just let him talk. Silence makes liars nervous, and Travis began to fidget. "I might need a little liquidity, Dad," he continued, his voice speeding up. "Just a bridge loan, maybe 50,000, just until the quarter closes. I know I asked last month, but this is a sure thing. If I don't cover the margin, I lose the whole portfolio." Courtney chimed in, stabbing a piece of steak with unnecessary force. "We really need this break, Doug. Travis has been working so hard. He deserves to relax without worrying about cash flow." I looked at them. The entitlement was suffocating. But then my gaze drifted past Travis's shoulder, through the open archway that led to the mudroom. The lights were on, casting a harsh glow on the slate floor. That was when I saw it. Travis's heavy Timberland boots were kicked haphazardly against the wall. They were drying, but they weren't just wet from the snow. The thick rubber treads were caked with a dense reddish-brown substance. Clay. My heart hammered against my ribs. I am an engineer. I know the soil composition of this area better than I know the back of my own hand. The topsoil in our yard is black and loamy for about 2 feet. Below that is a layer of sandy mix. You don't hit that heavy red clay unless you dig deep, at least 4 or 5 feet down. You do not get red clay on your boots from shoveling a walkway. You do not get it from clearing a driveway. You only get that kind of mud if you are digging a hole deep enough to bury something, or someone. Vera was right. The realization washed over me, cold and absolute. My son hadn't been sleeping last night. He had been out there in the freezing dark, digging into the earth, preparing a trap while I slept upstairs. I looked back at Travis. He was still talking about interest rates and market volatility, completely unaware that his boots had just screamed his guilt louder than any confession. I set my wineglass down with a deliberate click. "Go to Aspen," I said, my voice steady, hiding the tremor in my hands. "We can talk about the money when you get back." Travis smiled, thinking he had won. He raised his glass. "To family," he said. I didn't raise mine. I just watched the red clay drying on his boots, knowing that this was the last meal I would ever share with the monster who had replaced my son. The last plate was barely cleared from the table when Courtney made her move. She did not offer coffee or dessert. Instead, she reached into her oversized tote bag and pulled out a thick blue folder. She placed it on the mahogany surface with a thud that sounded like a gavel striking a judge's bench. The dinner conversation about ski trips and Hermes bags vanished instantly, replaced by a suffocating tension. Travis shifted in his chair, pulling at his collar. He looked everywhere except at me. Courtney, however, locked her eyes on mine. She slid the folder across the table until it rested just inches from my wine glass. She opened it, revealing a document with the words, "Durable Power of Attorney," printed in bold, aggressive letters at the top. Beside the document, she placed a heavy Montblanc pen, my own pen, which she must have taken from my study earlier. "Dad, we have been talking," she began, her voice dripping with a concern that felt as artificial as the sweetener she put in her tea. "Travis and I are worried about you. You are getting older. The house is big and there are so many bills and accounts to manage. Last week you forgot to turn off the porch light. Yesterday you missed a call from the bank." I listened to her list these fabricated infractions. I had not forgotten the porch light. The bulb had burned out, and I replaced it. The bank had not called. I managed my portfolio with the precision of the engineer I had been for 40 years. But I knew arguing with them was a trap. If I defended my mental state, they would just claim my defensiveness was a symptom of dementia. Travis finally spoke up, his voice tight. "It is just a precaution, Dad. This just lets me handle the boring stuff for you. You sign this and you never have to worry about writing a check or checking a stock ticker again. I will handle everything." I looked at the paper. It was not just a precaution. It was a total surrender. This document gave Travis full control over my bank accounts, my investment portfolio, and even the deed to this house. If I signed this, I would be a guest in my own home within 24 hours and a resident of a nursing home within a week. I reached for the pen. My hand hovered over the signature line. I could feel their eyes burning into me. They were holding their breath. I thought about the red clay on Travis's boots. I thought about the snow piled over the furnace vent. They did not just want control. They wanted to erase me. I made my hand tremble. It was not hard. The rage simmering inside me made my whole body vibrate. I gripped the pen loosely, letting it shake violently against the paper, leaving a jagged ink mark that looked nothing like a signature. Then I let my fingers go limp. The heavy pen clattered onto the table and rolled onto the floor. I brought my hand to my chest and let out a cough. A deep, wet, hacking cough that I forced from my lungs. I squeezed my eyes shut, feigning a dizzy spell. "I can't," I wheezed, rubbing my temples. "My eyes. The letters are swimming. I am so tired, Travis." The wine went to my head. Travis slammed his hand on the table. The silverware rattled. "Just sign it, Dad. It takes 2 seconds. Do not be difficult." His mask had slipped. The concerned son was gone, replaced by a desperate debtor who needed access to millions before the markets opened on Monday. I stood up, using the table for support, keeping my posture hunched and frail. "Not tonight," I mumbled, playing the part of the confused old man to perfection. "I need to lie down. We will do it in the morning. Before you go." I did not wait for their permission. I turned and shuffled toward the stairs, leaving the unsigned document on the table. Behind me, the silence was heavy and dangerous. I could feel Travis staring at my back, his gaze dark and violent. I had bought myself 12 hours, but as I climbed the stairs, I knew I had also just confirmed that I was an obstacle that needed to be removed. The digital clock on my nightstand read 2:14 in the morning, but the house felt suspended in a timeless, suffocating dark. Outside, the wind battered the north face of the brickwork, rattling the window panes in their frames. It was the kind of storm that usually made me feel grateful for the sturdy roof over my head. But tonight, the walls did not feel like protection. They felt like the sides of a cage. I lay perfectly still under the heavy down comforter, my breathing shallow and controlled. I did not dare to toss or turn. The old house had acoustics that carried sound in strange ways, and I knew that if I made the bed springs squeak, The predators downstairs would freeze, and they were there. I could feel their presence like a drop in barometric pressure. Then I heard it. It was faint, buried under the howl of the gale, but unmistakable to ears that had lived in this house for 40 years. The sliding glass door in the kitchen was being opened. It was a heavy, triple-paned door that rolled on a track I kept meticulously greased, but tonight it made a low, rolling rumble. Someone was going out into the blizzard. I strained my ears, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. A moment later came the sound that turned my blood to ice. Scrape, clang. It was the sound of an aluminum shovel striking the stone pavers of the patio. Why would my son be shoveling the patio at 2 in the morning in the middle of a whiteout? The answer sat heavy in my gut. He wasn't clearing a path. He was building something, or hiding something. I closed my eyes, and suddenly the darkness of the bedroom was replaced by the bright, warm memory of the kitchen 5 years ago. My late wife, Elizabeth, was standing at the sink, her hand deep in soapy water. It was the night Travis had first brought Courtney home for dinner. I had been charmed by the girl's bright smile and her compliments about my architectural drawings, but Elizabeth had been quiet all evening. When the kids left, I had wrapped my arms around her waist and asked what was wrong. She had turned to me, her hands dripping suds onto the floor, her expression terrified. "Douglas," she had whispered, her voice trembling. "Did you see how she looked at the china cabinet?" She wasn't admiring the craftsmanship. She was counting the plates. She didn't look at Travis once during the entire meal, unless he was talking about his trust fund. I had laughed it off. I told her she was being a protective mother. I told her she was imagining things. I opened my eyes to the dark room, a single tear leaking out and sliding into my ear. "You were right, Elizabeth," I whispered into the empty air. "You saw the wolf at the door while I was inviting it in for tea." The scraping sound downstairs stopped. Then came the heavy thud of boots being kicked off on the mudroom mat. The footsteps returned, moving softly across the kitchen tile. They were whispering again. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was conspiratorial and urgent. Travis wasn't just a bad son. He was a puppet, and the puppeteer was standing right there beside him, pulling the strings that would lead to my demise. I gripped the sheets, my knuckles turning white. I would not sleep tonight. I would lie here and mourn the boy I raised, because the man downstairs had just died to me. The sun did not truly rise that morning. It merely shifted the sky from black to a bruised, heavy gray as the blizzard swallowed Chicago whole. From my kitchen window, the world had disappeared behind a curtain of driving white powder. Inside, the atmosphere was frantic. Travis and Courtney were moving with a speed that felt less like holiday excitement and more like a tactical evacuation. I sat at the breakfast island, nursing a cup of black coffee that I had no intention of finishing. I wore my old cardigan, hunching my shoulders to appear smaller, frailer. I watched my son through the steam rising from the mug. He was wearing his heavy coat indoors, sweating slightly at the temples. He wasn't checking the flight status on his phone. He was checking the weather report for our specific zip code. Courtney was already by the front door, tapping her foot impatiently. "The car is running, Travis," she called out, her voice shrill. "If we don't leave now, we will miss the connection." "I am coming," he snapped back, wiping his palms on his jeans. He turned to me, his eyes wide and unblinking. He walked over and placed a hand on my shoulder. His grip was too tight. "Dad, listen to me very carefully," he said, leaning down so his face was level with mine. "The storm is getting worse. They are calling for ice." I nodded slowly, keeping my expression vacant. "I know, son. Winter in Chicago." "No, Dad. This is different." He interrupted, urgency leaking into his tone. "It is dangerous out there, especially the back deck. The wind is whipping around the house and turning everything into a skating rink." I checked it myself. I remembered the sound of the shovel at 2 in the morning. I remembered the red clay on his boots. I knew exactly what he had checked. I went ahead and locked the back deadbolt. He continued pointing a finger at the door as if it were a loaded weapon. Do not unlock it. Do not go out there for any reason. If the power goes out, just wrap up in blankets. Do not go check the generator. Do not go check the vents. Just stay inside. That was the first time. I took a sip of coffee. Okay, Travis. I will stay put. He didn't seem satisfied. He walked back to the sliding glass door and rattled the handle, ensuring it was immovable. He stared out into the white void where he had buried his trap, then turned back to me. I mean it, Dad. You know how your balance is. One slip out there and... He trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. He wasn't afraid I would fall. He was afraid I would survive. I put plenty of leftovers in the fridge, he added, checking his watch. You have lasagna. You have soup. There is absolutely no reason for you to open that door. Promise me. That was the second time. Courtney honked the horn from the driveway, a long, aggressive blast that made us both jump. Travis grabbed his carry-on bag. He looked at me one last time, standing in the archway of the kitchen. He looked like a man trying to convince himself he wasn't a monster. Stay inside, Dad, he said for the third time, his voice dropping to a whisper. I love you. I looked at him. I looked at the son who used to ask me to check under his bed for monsters, who was now the monster standing in my kitchen. I love you too, son, I lied. Have a safe flight. He turned and ran out into the snow, the heavy front door slamming shut behind him. The lock clicked. I sat there in the silence, listening to the muffled roar of his engine fading down the driveway. He had left me with a locked door, a freezer full of food, and a death sentence waiting in the backyard. He thought he had trapped a helpless old man. He had no idea he had just locked himself out of his inheritance. The heavy rumble of the garage door opening vibrated through the floorboards beneath my feet. It sounded less like a mechanism and more like the growl of a beast being unleashed. I watched through the front bay window as Travis backed his pristine black Mercedes SUV out into the swirling white chaos of the driveway. The tires crunched loudly against the fresh snow, packing it down into icy tracks that would soon be covered again by the storm. Just before they reached the street, the passenger window rolled down. A blast of freezing air surely rushed into their heated cabin, but Courtney did not seem to mind. She leaned out slightly, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the weather. She looked right at the window where she knew I was standing. She raised her hand in a wave that was too slow and too deliberate. Her lips curled into a smile that did not reach her eyes. It was not a smile of affection or even of goodbye. It was the smirk of a gambler who had just pushed all their chips into the center of the table because they knew the deck was stacked. It was a smile of premature victory. Then the window rolled up. The dark tint hid her face. The Mercedes turned left and accelerated, disappearing into the gray curtain of the blizzard. The silence that followed was instant and crushing. I stood alone in the center of my 4,000-square-foot living room. Usually when the house was empty, I felt a pang of loneliness, a longing for the days when Elizabeth was alive and the halls were filled with noise. But today I did not feel lonely. I felt hunted. The silence was not peaceful. It was heavy and pregnant with threat. Every creak of the house settling in the cold sounded like a footstep. Every gust of wind against the siding sounded like a whisper. My son had left me with a locked door and a refrigerator full of food, but the air in the house tasted like metal and danger. He had emphasized staying inside not to keep me safe, but to keep me contained. He wanted me to feel secure enough to let my guard down, or perhaps bored enough to wander out the back door to check the generator or the vents. I needed to stop thinking like a father and start thinking like the engineer I used to be. I needed to inspect the structure. I needed data. I turned away from the window and walked with purpose toward the built-in mahogany cabinet in the den. This was where I kept my best scotch, the 30-year-old single malts that I saved for special occasions. A weaker man might have poured a drink to numb the betrayal, to drown the image of his son's muddy boots. I opened the cabinet doors. The crystal decanters sparkled in the dim light. I reached past the alcohol, pushing aside a bottle of Macallan. My hand closed around cold, heavy metal. I pulled out my old Zeiss military binoculars. They were encased in worn black rubber, heavy as a brick, and powerful enough to see the rivets on a bridge from a mile away. I did not need alcohol. I needed clarity. I needed to see exactly what kind of grave my son had dug for me in my own backyard. The stairs creaked under my weight as I ascended to the second floor, the only sound in a house that felt increasingly like a mausoleum. I entered the master bedroom, a space I had largely avoided since Elizabeth passed away 3 years ago. The air inside was stale and still preserved like a museum exhibit. I did not turn on the lights. I walked straight to the large bay window that overlooked the backyard, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. I raised the heavy Zeiss binoculars to my eyes. The German optics cut through the swirling white chaos of the blizzard with terrifying clarity. I adjusted the focus wheel, my fingers trembling slightly, not from age or cold, but from a sudden surge of adrenaline. I swept the gaze along the rear foundation of the house. The wind had sculpted the snow into natural drifts, smooth curves banking against the fences and the garden shed. But against the north wall, right where the mechanical room sat in the basement, the topography changed. It was not a drift. It was a mound. It was jagged and compacted, the telltale sign of a shovel's work, not the wind's hand. I zoomed in closer. The mound was strategically placed directly over the white PVC intake and exhaust pipes for the high-efficiency furnace. My breath hitched in my throat. I lowered the binoculars for a second, blinking against the harsh reality, then raised them again, just to be sure. I spent 40 years of my life as a structural engineer, calculating load-bearing limits and airflow dynamics for skyscrapers. I did not need a manual to understand the physics of what I was looking at. When an exhaust pipe is buried under dense, wet snow, the dangerous byproducts of combustion have nowhere to go. In a modern furnace system, there are safety switches designed to shut the unit down, but those switches can be bypassed or fail if the blockage is partial. If the gas cannot escape into the atmosphere, it backs up. It flows back into the heat exchanger. It leaks into the ductwork. It silently pumps odorless, colorless carbon monoxide into every room of the house. Travis had not just blocked a pipe. He had turned my own heating system into a gas chamber. He knew I would keep the windows closed against the storm. He knew I would crank up the heat to combat the draft. He was counting on it. He wanted me to fall asleep in front of the TV, warm and comfortable, and simply never wake up. I lowered the binoculars, the rubber cold against my eye sockets. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the drafty window. This was a silent execution. If I had gone to sleep as he suggested, I would be dead by morning. The coroner would call it a tragic accident caused by a freak snowstorm. Travis would play the grieving son and collect the insurance payout before the snow even melted. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but my mind was icy clear. I needed to verify the next step of his plan. If he had rigged the furnace to kill me, he surely would not have left the safety net intact. I lowered the binoculars, and the heavy rubber casing landed on the windowsill with a dull thud. My hands were steady, but my heart was beating a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I had seen the blocked vent outside, but an engineer knows that a single point of failure is rarely fatal in a well-designed system. Redundancy is the golden rule of survival. A blocked intake pipe should trigger the safety switch on the furnace. If that fails, the carbon monoxide detectors are the last line of defense. They are the sentinels that scream when the invisible killer enters the room. I turned away from the window and walked into the upstairs hallway. The house was so quiet, I could hear the refrigerator humming downstairs. High on the wall near the linen closet sat the first detector. It was a standard white plastic disc, the kind that is supposed to blink a reassuring green light every 30 seconds. I stood underneath it and waited. 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 40 seconds. Nothing. The little plastic eye remained dark. I dragged a wooden chair over from the guest room and stepped up. My joints protested the movement, but I ignored the ache. I reached up and twisted the cover counterclockwise. It came off easily, too easily. I looked inside the battery compartment. It was empty. The rectangular space where the 9-volt battery should have been was just a hollow void. There was no battery on the floor, no battery on the nearby shelf. It had not fallen out. It had been removed. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. I climbed down and moved with urgency to the master bedroom. This unit was different. It was a hardwired model connected directly to the house's electrical grid with a battery backup. It was the most reliable alarm money could buy. I had installed it myself 5 years ago. I gripped the device and pulled it from its mounting bracket. It should have been tethered by 3 color-coded wires. Instead, it came away completely in my hand. I stared at the back of the unit. The copper wires had not come loose from the wire nuts. They had been cut. The ends were jagged and bright, exposing the fresh metal. Someone had taken a pair of wire cutters, stood where I was standing, and severed the connection with deliberate precision. I dropped the useless piece of plastic onto the carpet. This was no longer a suspicion of negligence. This was not about a lazy son who forgot to shovel a vent or forgot to change a battery. Negligence is passive. Removing a battery is active. Cutting a hardwired connection is an act of war. Travis had not just set a trap, he had dismantled the safety net. He had walked through this house, checking every room not to ensure my comfort, but to ensure my silence. He wanted to make sure that when the gas filled my lungs and my brain began to starve of oxygen, there would be no piercing shriek to wake me up. He wanted me to drift off into a permanent sleep while he sipped hot cocoa in Aspen, waiting for the phone call that would make him a millionaire. I stood in the center of the bedroom, surrounded by the ghosts of my family, and realized that the boy I raised was dead. The man who left this morning was nothing but a cold-blooded executioner. I stood in the center of the master bedroom, staring at the severed wires dangling from the ceiling. A normal man might have panicked. He might have called 911 immediately, or run out the front door screaming. But panic is a luxury for the unprepared. I am an engineer. When a structure is compromised, you do not run away. You assess the damage. You find the source of the failure. And then you fix it. I needed to see the heart of the beast. I moved quickly but carefully down the main staircase, my hand gripping the banister tight. The house was deceptively peaceful. The only sound was the wind howling outside and the low rhythmic hum of the furnace kicking on again. That hum, which used to signal warmth and safety, now sounded like a countdown. I opened the door to the basement. A wave of heat hit me instantly. It was not a comfortable, cozy warmth. It was a dry, suffocating heat that made the air feel thick and heavy. Travis must have cranked the thermostat up to 80 degrees before he left. He wanted the furnace running constantly. He wanted maximum output, maximum exhaust. I descended the wooden steps into the mechanical room. The concrete floor was cold beneath my slippers, but sweat was already prickling on my forehead. The furnace dominated the room, a massive metal box that hummed and vibrated with power. I walked up to the small inspection window on the front panel. In a properly functioning natural gas furnace, the flame should be a crisp, steady blue. Blue means complete combustion. It means the mix of fuel and oxygen is perfect. It means safety. I peered through the glass. What I saw made my blood run cold despite the stifling heat. The flames inside were not blue. They were dancing lazily, licking at the heat exchanger with long, flickering tongues of yellow and orange. Yellow flames mean one thing: incomplete combustion. The furnace was starving for air. The intake pipe outside was blocked, just as I had suspected, choking off the oxygen supply. And when a furnace cannot breathe, it exhales poison. The carbon monoxide that should have been vented harmlessly outside was now backing up, seeping into the plenum, and being pushed through the ductwork into every room of my house. I was standing inside a gas chamber, that was slowly filling up. I could feel a dull ache starting behind my eyes, the first whisper of the headache that signals CO poisoning. My legs felt a little heavy. The air tasted metallic. I reached for the emergency shut-off switch on the side of the unit. My hand hovered over the red plate. If I flipped it, the heat would stop. The poison would stop. I would be safe. But then I remembered the red clay on Travis's boots. I remembered the smile on Courtney's face. I remembered the severed wires upstairs. If I turned it off now and called the police, Travis could claim it was an accident. He could say the snow drifted naturally. He could say the wires were old and broke on their own. He would hire a lawyer. He would cry in court. He would get away with it. I needed proof. I needed undeniable, irrefutable evidence that this was not a malfunction, but a murder attempt. I needed to document the scene exactly as he had left it. I pulled my hand back from the switch. I would not turn it off yet. Not until I had a witness. I turned and headed for the basement window, the one Travis had forgotten about. It was time to go outside. I knew that opening the back door was not an option. Travis had warned me 3 times not to go out there, and his warnings were not born of concern, but of calculation. He had turned the patio into a sheet of black ice, a slip-and-fall accident waiting to happen. If the carbon monoxide did not finish me off, a broken neck on the concrete surely would. I needed another way out, a path that he had not booby-trapped, because he simply did not respect me enough to consider it. I turned my gaze to the far corner of the basement, where a small rectangular egress window sat high up on the concrete wall. It was narrow, dusty, and covered in spiderwebs. It was the kind of emergency exit designed for nimble teenagers or firemen, not for a 74-year-old man with a bad hip. Travis had grown up in this house. He knew every creak and corner, but he had looked at that window and dismissed it. He saw his father as a fragile relic, incapable of lifting his own weight, let alone crawling through a hole in the wall. That arrogance was his first mistake. I moved to the old storage closet under the stairs. I did not dare go upstairs to retrieve my wool coat or boots. The air up there was already getting toxic, and I could not waste the oxygen. Instead, I dug through the boxes of forgotten winter gear. I found an old canvas Carhartt jacket stained with oil and paint from my days on the job site. It smelled of mildew, but it was thick. I pulled it on over my cardigan. I found a pair of rubber work boots that were a size too big, but they would have to do. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out my digital camera. It was a compact Nikon I used for birdwatching. I checked the battery. Full charge. I tucked it deep inside the inner pocket of the canvas jacket, shielding it against the cold and moisture. This little black box was about to become the most dangerous weapon in my arsenal. I dragged a heavy wooden crate over to the wall beneath the window. My knees protested the weight grinding audibly in the quiet basement, but I gritted my teeth. I stepped up onto the crate. The window latch was rusted shut, fused by years of neglect. I grabbed a hammer from the workbench and struck the handle. Once. Twice. The rust shattered and the latch gave way with a screech of metal. I pushed the window open. The storm did not just enter, it invaded. A blast of wind hit me like a physical hammer blow, carrying a temperature of 15 degrees below zero. The cold was instantaneous and brutal, stinging my eyes and stealing the breath from my lungs. Snow swirled into the basement, mixing with the stale hot air of the furnace room. I grabbed the ledge. The concrete was rough and icy. I hoisted myself up, channeling every ounce of strength I had left. My shoulders burned. My hips screamed in protest. For a second, I hung there, half in and half out, suspended between the gas chamber inside and the freezing hell outside. I thought of Travis sitting in a first-class seat, sipping champagne on his way to Aspen. The anger gave me the final push. I kicked my legs and scrambled through the opening, tumbling out onto the frozen ground. I landed hard on my shoulder in a deep drift of snow. The impact knocked the wind out of me, but I was out. I lay there for a moment, the snow melting against my hot face, listening to the wind howl. I was cold. I was in pain. But I was alive, and I was now behind enemy lines. I rolled onto my knees, checking the camera first. It was safe. I stood up, fighting the gale, and began the trudge toward the back of the house. Travis thought he had buried me, but he had only forced me to dig my way out. The wind clawed at my face as I stood up from the snowdrift, wiping the powder from my eyes. I was standing in my own backyard, but it felt like enemy territory. I trudged through the knee-deep snow toward the rear patio, moving parallel to the house to avoid being seen from the windows I had just escaped. My target was the walkway leading to the back door, the very path Travis had sworn was safe. I stopped 10 feet away, crouching behind the cover of the frozen hydrangea bushes. The slate pavers of the walkway looked deceptively clear. To the untrained eye, they looked wet, perhaps a little damp from the storm, but manageable. That is the terrifying beauty of black ice. It does not look like danger. It looks like safety. I remembered Travis's voice in the kitchen, so full of concern. I put down plenty of salt, Dad. It is safe. I needed to be sure. I reached down my joints, screaming in protest against the bitter cold, and dug a loose landscaping brick out of the garden border. It was heavy, rough-hewn granite with jagged edges. I weighed it in my hand, feeling its mass. Then, with a low, underhand toss, I lofted it onto the walkway. Physics is a language I have spoken for 40 years. When a heavy stone hits salted concrete, there is friction. There is resistance. It should land with a thud, bounce once perhaps, and roll a few inches before coming to a stop. But the stone did not stop. It hit the slate and accelerated. It glided across the 20-foot expanse with terrifying speed, silent and smooth like a hockey puck on a fresh rink. It traveled the entire length of the patio without slowing down for a fraction of a second, until it cracked against the bottom of the back door with a loud, sharp thwack. I stared at the stone sitting there against the doorframe. My stomach turned over. Travis had not salted this path. He had watered it. In sub-zero temperatures, he had deliberately hosed down the only exit route from the kitchen. The cruelty of the design was breathtaking. The plan was not just to poison me, it was a two-stage execution. Phase 1 was the furnace filling the house with carbon monoxide. Phase 2 was the panic. He knew that if the gas did not kill me in my sleep, I would wake up choking and disoriented. My brain starving for oxygen, I would stumble to the back door, the closest source of fresh air. I would throw it open and run out. And the moment my foot hit that invisible sheet of ice, momentum and gravity would do the rest. I would go down hard. A shattered hip, a broken pelvis, or more likely, given the speed and the hardness of the slate, a broken neck. I would lie there unable to move, freezing to death, while the gas poured out over my broken body. It was a failsafe. He wanted to make absolutely sure that I did not survive the night. I raised my camera, my fingers numb inside the gloves, and snapped the picture. The flash illuminated the unnatural glass-like sheen of the ice, capturing the weapon that was supposed to snap my spine. I had the evidence of the gas, and now I had the evidence of the trap. But I still needed the smoking gun. I turned my eyes toward the furnace vent. I stood before the white mound that hugged the foundation of my home. To anyone else passing by, it looked like a natural snowdrift sculpted by the gale. But as I stared at it, I could see the unnatural symmetry of the pile. It was too high and too packed. I looked around for a tool and found a rusted garden spade leaning against the side of the chimney where the gardener had left it months ago. I grabbed the cold metal handle and dropped to my knees in the snow. I did not hack at the drift wildly. I scraped the layers away with the precision of a surgeon. I needed to uncover the truth without destroying the crime scene. My breath plumed in white clouds in front of my face as I worked. The wind howled around the corner of the house, trying to push me over, but I was anchored by a rage so profound it felt like a physical weight. After removing about 6 inches of packed snow, my spade hit something solid. It was a dull thud, not the hollow ring of the PVC pipe. I used my gloved hand to brush away the remaining powder. My stomach twisted into a knot. Wedged tightly into the mouth of the intake pipe was a square of plywood. It was not a random piece of debris carried by the storm. I could see the fresh saw marks on the edges. Someone had cut this wood specifically to fit this opening. They had jammed it in with force to ensure no air could get through. Then they had carefully piled snow on top to hide their handiwork. Travis had not just neglected the house. He had engineered a suffocation device. He had stood right here in the dark, freezing cold, and built a plug to turn my home into a gas chamber. He had calculated exactly how to kill me without ever pulling a trigger. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the Nikon camera again. My hands were shaking not from the cold, but from the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I forced myself to be steady. I framed the shot. Click. The flash illuminated the wood wedged in the pipe, exposing the raw grain and the deliberate nature of the blockage. I took shots from multiple angles, ensuring the context of the house and the foundation was clear. Then I saw it. Just to the right of the pipe, where the ground was slightly lower, there was a patch of mud that had not been fully covered by the snow. The freezing temperatures had turned the mud into hard stone, preserving what was pressed into it. It was a footprint, a deep, clear impression of a heavy boot. I leaned in closer. The tread pattern was unmistakable. It featured a distinctive star shape on the heel and deep, aggressive lugs on the sole. I knew those boots. I had bought them for Travis myself 3 years ago for a hiking trip we never took. He had been in such a hurry to finish his deadly task and get back inside to the warmth that he had been careless. He had stepped in the mud and hadn't bothered to cover his tracks, thinking the blizzard would do it for him. I snapped picture after picture of that footprint. I placed my own glove next to it for scale and took another photo. This was the signature on the death warrant. I had the black ice on the walkway. I had the blocked vent. And now I had the footprint placing my son at the scene of the crime. I tucked the camera back into my pocket, feeling the hard plastic against my chest. I did not pull the wood out. If I cleared the vent now, the evidence of the immediate danger would be lost. I needed Mike to see this with his own eyes. I needed the police to see it. I stood up, my knees cracking in the cold, and looked at the house. It was no longer a home. It was a crime scene waiting to be processed. I scrambled back through the basement window, my limbs aching from the cold, but my mind sharp with purpose. I landed on the concrete floor with a heavy thud, breathing hard. The air down here was thick and stifling hot, a stark contrast to the sub-zero gale outside. The furnace was still humming, still pumping its invisible poison into the veins of my home. I did not waste a second. I marched over to the red emergency switch mounted on the side of the unit and flipped it. The machine shuddered and fell silent. The silence was sudden and absolute, ringing in my ears, louder than the roar of the fire. I had stopped the active threat, but the house was still a loaded weapon. The gas was already inside. I needed a professional witness, someone whose testimony would hold up in a court of law against whatever high-priced lawyers Travis would inevitably hire. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. My fingers were stiff, but I dialed the number from memory. Mike was not just a contractor, he was the guy who had installed this system 20 years ago. He was a man of few words and absolute integrity, the kind of friend you call when you need to bury a body, or in this case, when someone tried to bury you. He picked up on the second ring. Doug. It's Sunday. The Bears game is on. Everything okay? I didn't bother with pleasantries. Mike, I need you at my house, now. There was a pause on the line. The tone of my voice must have cut through the noise of the game in the background, because when he spoke again, all the casualness was gone. What's wrong? Is it the boiler? I looked at the yellow flames dying out behind the inspection glass. I wish it was just a broken boiler, Mike. Listen to me carefully. Bring your commercial-grade carbon monoxide analyzer, and bring a video camera. Not your phone. A real camera with a timestamp. Doug, what is going on? You sound... Just get here, Mike. Enter through the side garage door. I will leave it unlocked. Do not ring the bell. And Mike, wear your respirator. I hung up before he could ask another question. I knew he would come. I leaned against the cold metal of the furnace, feeling the residual heat radiating from the casing. My head was throbbing, a dull, rhythmic ache behind my temples. The CO was already working on me. I needed to get fresh air, but I couldn't leave yet. I had to secure the perimeter. I had to make sure that when Mike arrived, he walked into a crime scene, not a tragedy. I checked the time on my phone. Travis was probably boarding his flight right now, ordering a drink and toasting to his inheritance. I stared at the dark furnace. You made one mistake, son. You forgot that I built this life with my own hands, and I know how to tear it down. I waited in the detached garage, my breath pluming in the freezing air, pacing back and forth on the cold concrete. 30 minutes had never felt so long. Every second that ticked by was another second the poison seeped deeper into the walls of the home I had built. Finally, the heavy rumble of a diesel engine cut through the wind. Mike's work van pulled up to the curb, avoiding the driveway as I had instructed. He stepped out carrying a bright yellow rugged case and a professional video camera. He looked like a man marching into a war zone, not a suburban backyard. I met him at the side door. Mike is a big guy, built like a linebacker with grease permanently stained into his knuckles, but his face was pale. He did not say hello. He just handed me an industrial respirator mask. Put this on, he ordered, his voice muffled by his own gear. We are not playing around with this, Doug. We stepped into the mudroom, and the silence of the house was shattered instantly. The yellow device in Mike's hand began to chirp, a slow, rhythmic warning that rapidly accelerated into a frantic, piercing shriek. The sound echoed off the tile walls like a siren. He held the device up so I could see the screen. The digital numbers were glowing an angry red. 400 parts per million. Mike grabbed my shoulder and practically dragged me back out into the garage, slamming the door shut to seal the fumes inside. He ripped his mask off, his eyes wide with genuine terror. Jesus Christ! Doug, he shouted, the wind snatching the words from his mouth. Do you understand what that number means, 400? If you had taken a nap in that recliner, you would be dead in 2 hours. 3 hours tops. This isn't a leak, Doug. This is a gas chamber. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, his thick fingers fumbling with the screen. I am calling 911. We need the fire department to vent the structure immediately. And we need the police. Whoever serviced your furnace last is going to prison for manslaughter. I reached out and clamped my hand over his phone. No, I said firmly. Put it away, Mike. He looked at me like I had lost my mind. Doug, this is not a debate. That house is a lethal weapon. You cannot go back in there. I know. I replied, my voice steady and cold. But if you call them now, the fire department comes. They vent the house. They find the snow blocked the pipe. They call it a tragic accident caused by the storm. My son gets a slap on the wrist for negligence, and next week he tries something else. Maybe next time he cuts the brake lines on my truck. Mike froze. The color drained from his face completely. Your son, I looked him dead in the eye. Travis did this, Mike. He blocked the vent with plywood. He watered the walkway to create black ice. He cut the alarm wires upstairs. He did not make a mistake. He tried to execute me. I saw the realization crash into him. The horror on his face shifted into a dark, simmering anger. He looked at the house, then back at me. I need you to document it, I continued. Go back in there. Record the readings with the timestamp. Film the blocked vent. Film the cut wires. If we call the police now, he walks away. I need undeniable proof. I don't just want to survive this, Mike. I want to catch the whole nest. Mike stared at me for a long moment. Then he slowly lowered his phone. He looked at the house, then back at me. He put his mask back on and nodded once. Okay, Doug, he said, his voice hard. Let's go nail the bastard. I left Mike in the basement monitoring the air quality and stepped back out into the howling storm. The wind nearly knocked me over as I crossed the narrow alleyway that separated my estate from the row of dilapidated garage apartments where Vera lived. My house was a mansion turned into a death trap, but as I climbed the rickety wooden stairs to Vera's unit, I realized that safety often comes in humble packages. I knocked on the peeling paint of her door. It opened immediately. Vera pulled me inside and slammed the door shut against the gale. The first thing that hit me was the temperature. It was barely warmer inside than it was outside. The air smelled of stale tea and cheap cat food. Vera was wrapped in 3 different knit shawls, and she was wearing fingerless gloves inside her own home. A small space heater buzzed in the corner, fighting a losing battle against the drafts coming through the single-pane windows. I looked around the cramping studio apartment. The furniture was mismatched and worn. There were photos of grandchildren who clearly never visited. She had almost nothing, yet she had spent her limited energy watching over me. I did not have to say a word. She knew. She walked over to a small chipped porcelain bowl on her bedside table and fished out a small silver USB drive. Her hand trembled slightly as she held it out to me, not from fear, but from the bone-deep cold of poverty. "Take this," she said, her voice raspy. "I told you I see everything, Douglas. But I also hear everything." I took the cold metal drive. "What is this, Vera?" "My car," she explained, gesturing to the window. "It is a piece of junk, but my grandson installed a dash cam for me last Christmas. It has a motion sensor. It records even when the engine is off." She stepped closer, looking up at me with those sharp, intelligent eyes. "Your son and that woman. They stood right next to my bumper yesterday afternoon. They were arguing. They were loud. They thought because I am old and poor, I am also deaf. They thought because the street was empty, the world was empty." I gripped the USB drive. It felt heavier than lead. "They talked about the insurance," she whispered. "They talked about the timeline. I downloaded the footage for you. It is all there. Every hateful word." I looked at this woman who was shivering in her unheated apartment, protecting a man who lived in a fortress across the street. I had millions in the bank and a son who wanted me dead. She had an EBT card that was declined and a heart of gold. "Thank you, Vera," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "You have no idea what you have done." She just pulled her shawls tighter. "Go," she said. "Go finish it." And Douglas put a coat on. "You look freezing." I walked back out into the storm, clutching the plastic drive in my fist. I had come looking for evidence, but I had found something else. I had found the difference between family by blood and family by integrity. I crossed the street back to my gas chamber, ready to listen to the sins of my son. I crossed the street back to my house, my hand gripping the small silver USB drive inside my pocket like a grenade. The wind was still howling, but the real storm was raging inside my chest. I entered through the side door, locking it tight behind me. The house was freezing now that the furnace was off, but the cold helped keep my mind sharp. I did not go upstairs. I went straight to my study on the first floor, a room lined with books on engineering and structural integrity. I sat down at my heavy oak desk and booted up my laptop. My fingers hovered over the USB port. I knew that once I plugged this in, there was no turning back. Ignorance is a kind of mercy, but I could no longer afford mercy. I inserted the drive. A folder popped up on the screen containing a single video file dated yesterday afternoon. I put on my headphones, turning the volume up to maximum. I needed to hear every syllable. The video was grainy at first, taken from the dashboard of Vera's old sedan across the alley. It showed the back of my house. The snow was falling lightly. Then Travis and Courtney walked into the frame. They were standing near my back fence, right next to where Vera's car was parked. They looked around, scanning the empty alley, but they never looked down at the battered car next to them. I pressed play. The audio was surprisingly clear, cutting through the wind. Courtney's voice came first, sharp and impatient. "Are you sure about the timeline, Travis? We need that money by Tuesday morning." If the insurance company drags their feet, Tony is going to break your legs. Travis laughed. It was a sound I had never heard before, a cruel, dismissive sound. Relax, babe. I checked the policy. Dad has a double indemnity clause for accidental death. If he dies in a house accident, we get the payout within 10 days, but they release an emergency advance almost immediately for funeral costs. That advance alone covers the VIG. My stomach churned. They were discussing my death like a business transaction. Courtney stepped closer to him, grabbing the lapels of his coat. But are you sure he will die, Travis? What if he just gets sick? What if he wakes up and calls 911? If he ends up a vegetable in a hospital bed, we are stuck with him. I am not changing his diapers. We will be bankrupt. Travis pulled her close and kissed her forehead, a tender gesture for a monstrous conversation. He won't wake up, I did the math. The CO levels will hit lethal toxicity by 3 a.m., and even if by some miracle he wakes up and tries to run, he pointed toward the back door. The ice will finish the job. A 74-year-old man slipping on slate snap. Lights out. It is foolproof. I paused the video. I took off the headphones. My hands were trembling so violently I had to grip the edge of the desk to steady them. It wasn't just greed. It wasn't just desperation. It was hatred. They viewed my life as nothing more than an obstacle to their comfort. I looked at the frozen image of my son on the screen, his face twisted in a confident smirk. I didn't see my boy anymore. I saw a stranger, and strangers don't get mercy. I ejected the drive and put it in my safe. The evidence was secured. Now it was time to check the finances. The video file was the smoking gun, but as an engineer, I know that every structural failure has a root cause. The hatred in their voices was the symptom, but I needed to find the disease. I closed the media player and opened a private browser window. Travis had always assumed that my technological literacy stopped at checking email and weather forecasts. He forgot that I was calculating load-bearing algorithms on mainframe computers before he was born. He also forgot that when he set up his independent trading firm 5 years ago, he used my server to host his private cloud, thinking he was saving a few dollars on hosting fees. I still had the administrative master key. I logged into his private drive. It took less than 30 seconds to bypass the weak password he used, which was his own birthday. I navigated through folders of failed business pitches and unanswered query letters until I found a spreadsheet simply titled Ledger. I opened it. The numbers on the screen were not just red, they were a bloodbath. My son was not just a bad investor. He was a degenerate gambler. The spreadsheet detailed a spiraling history of bets on everything from underground poker games in Chinatown to high-stakes sports betting. The losses were staggering, but the bottom line made my breath catch in my throat. Negative $485,000. Beside the final total was a note typed in bold capital letters. Due Tuesday. No extensions. The creditor was listed only as the Venetian Room. I knew that name. It wasn't a hotel. It was an illegal gambling den on the South Side run by people who didn't send collection agencies. They sent men with baseball bats. Travis wasn't just broke. He was a dead man walking. Unless he found $500,000 in 48 hours, his life was over. I opened a second tab and logged into my Prudential life insurance portal. I stared at the policy details. It was a standard policy I had taken out 20 years ago to ensure Travis would be taken care of if anything happened to me. Benefit amount $2 million. Primary beneficiary Travis Bennett. The math was so simple it was sickening. My life was the solution to his equation. If I died of natural causes, the payout would take months. But the policy had a double indemnity clause for accidental death. If I died in a tragic household accident like carbon monoxide poisoning during a storm, the insurance company would expedite an emergency advance to cover funeral and immediate estate expenses. That advance would be exactly enough to pay off the mob on Tuesday. I sat back in my chair, feeling the cold of the room seep into my bones. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a balance sheet correction. My son looked at me and didn't see a father. He saw a $2 million check that just needed to be cashed. He was willing to suffocate the man who taught him to ride a bike just to cover a debt he incurred at a card table. I closed the laptop. The sorrow was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He wanted a payout. I would make sure he got exactly what he deserved. I sat in the dim light of my study, the glow of the laptop screen casting long shadows against the bookshelves. The realization that my death was nothing more than a line item on my son's balance sheet had cauterized my heart. There was no more sadness left in me, only a cold, hard determination to survive and to punish. I picked up my phone. My hands were steady now. I scrolled to a contact I had not called on a Sunday in over 20 years. Andrew Hartman. Andrew was more than my lawyer. He was the man who had helped me incorporate my engineering firm and who had stood beside me at Elizabeth's funeral. He answered on the third ring, his voice thick with sleep, or perhaps a Sunday afternoon nap. Doug, is everything all right? Usually when clients call on weekends, it means someone is in jail or dead. I did not waste time with apologies. Andrew, I need you to go to your office. Now. I need you to draft a new estate plan. An irrevocable trust. Vocable. Andrew paused. I could hear the rustle of movement on the other end. Doug, slow down. We can discuss estate planning tomorrow morning. If this is about Travis and the ski trip, or if he asked for money again, we can handle it during business hours. It is about Travis. I interrupted, my voice low and dangerous. But not the ski trip. It is about the fact that he just tried to murder me for a $2 million insurance payout. The silence on the line was deafening. I could hear Andrew's breathing hitch. I just sent you an email, Andrew. It contains a video file and a spreadsheet. Open it. I waited. The seconds ticked by like hours. I heard the click of a mouse, then a sharp intake of breath. Then the audio from Vera's dashcam filled the silence between us. I heard Courtney's voice asking about the timeline. I heard Travis calculating the lethal dose of carbon monoxide. I heard my son betting my life against his gambling debt. When the clip ended, Andrew's voice was unrecognizable. It was no longer the voice of a friend or a tired lawyer. It was the voice of a prosecutor. Jesus Christ, Doug. Are you safe? Where are you? I am in the house, I said. Mike is here documenting the furnace. The police will be involved eventually, but first I need to hit them where it hurts. I want every penny I own moved into a trust for Vera Kowalski. I want the house listed for sale tomorrow, and I want the beneficiary on my life insurance policy changed to the Chicago Police Memorial Fund. I will be there in 20 minutes, Andrew said, the sound of keys jingling in the background. Keep the doors locked, Doug. And for God's sake, do not drink anything he might have left in the house. The line went dead. I lowered the phone. The legal army was on its way. Travis thought he was playing a game of checkers. He had no idea he had just sat down at a chessboard with a grandmaster. I stood up and walked to the window, watching the snow bury the driveway. The trap was set, but this time I was the one holding the trigger. The house was warm now. The furnace had been repaired, and the air was clean. But I sat in my study wearing my heavy coat, shivering from a cold that came from within. The digital clock on my desk read 7 o'clock. Right on schedule, the phone began to ring. It was a harsh, jarring sound in the quiet room. The caller ID displayed the face of my son, smiling in a photo taken years ago before gambling turned his soul into a calculator. I stared at the screen for a long moment. I let it ring 3 times. I needed him to sweat. I needed him to wonder if the gas had already finished the job. On the 4th ring, I picked up. I did not say hello. I let out a low, groaning breath, the sound of a man struggling to find air. Travis, I rasped. My voice was a masterpiece of deception. It was thready, weak, and slurred. "Is that you?" "Hey, Dad?" Travis's voice was too loud, too bright. It crackled with nervous energy. "Yeah, it is me. We just got settled in Aspen. I wanted to check on you. How are you holding up? The storm looks brutal on the news." I slumped forward in my chair, resting my forehead on my hand. I closed my eyes, visualizing the symptoms of carbon monoxide poisoning I had read about 1,000 times in safety manuals. I needed to feed him exactly what he wanted to hear. "It is so hot in here, Travis," I whined, letting a confused panic seep into my tone. "I feel dizzy." "The room is spinning, son. I think I need to open a window." "No." The word exploded out of him. It was sharp and commanding. "Do not open a window, Dad. You will freeze to death. It is 20 below zero out there. You are just tired. It is the pressure change from the storm." I paused, letting my breathing sound ragged and wet against the receiver. But my head, I whispered. It hurts so bad, like a hammer. And I am so sleepy. I just want to lie down right here on the floor. This was the moment. This was the test. If there was a single shred of humanity left in him, this was his chance to scream for me to get out, to call 911 to save his father. I waited. Instead, I heard him exhale. It was a long sigh of relief. "That is good, Dad," he said, his voice dropping to a soothing, hypnotic rhythm. "You are just exhausted. Do not fight it. Just go lie down on the couch. Close your eyes. The headache will go away if you sleep." He was coaching me through my own death. He was tucking me into a grave he had dug. But I trailed off, faking a wave of nausea. "Shh, sleep now, Dad," Travis urged. "Just go to sleep. I will call you in the morning." He hung up. The line went dead with a finality that echoed in the empty room. He did not say, "I love you." He did not say, "Call a doctor." He told a man complaining of dizziness and exhaustion in a house with a gas furnace to go to sleep. I lowered the phone slowly and placed it back on the cradle. I sat up straight, shedding the persona of the dying old man like a heavy coat. The weakness vanished. My hands stopped trembling. I looked at the phone. That call was recorded on my system. It was the final nail. He had confirmed his intent. He did not just set a trap, he pushed me into it and locked the lid. I stood up and walked to the window. The grief was gone. The time for acting was over. Now it was time to set the stage for the final act. I had a dinner party to prepare for, and the guest of honor had just RSVP'd for his own destruction. I hung up the phone and the silence returned, but this time it was not the silence of a victim waiting for the end. It was the silence of a hunter setting a snare. I looked at Mike, who was standing in the doorway of the study, holding a rugged plastic case that looked military grade. He had heard the entire conversation. He did not ask if I was okay. He knew I was far past okay. He just nodded once and set the case on my desk. "We have work to do, Doug," he said quietly. "If we are going to nail them, we need cinema quality. No grainy cell phone footage. We need to see the pores on their faces when they walk in here." For the next 2 hours, my home was transformed into a high-definition surveillance grid. Mike moved with the efficiency of a man who had done this before, although usually for jealous husbands, not targeted fathers. We started in the living room, the stage where the final act would play out. Mike drilled a tiny hole into the spine of a faux leather encyclopedia on the top shelf of the built-in bookcase. Inside, he mounted a wide-angle lens capable of capturing the entire room in 4K resolution. It was positioned perfectly to look down upon the armchair, where Travis expected to find my corpse. We moved to the kitchen. Mike hid a second camera inside the housing of the motion sensor for the alarm system, the very system Travis thought he had disabled. This one pointed directly at the sliding glass door and the kitchen island. It would capture their entry. It would capture the exact moment they realized the house was not a tomb, but a trap. The hardest part was the exterior. We braved the sub-zero wind one last time to mount a night vision camera under the eaves of the back porch. It was aimed directly at the walkway, specifically at the patch of black ice Travis had created. I wanted that shot more than anything. I wanted to record the physics of his cruelty. I wanted a jury to see the lethal sheet of ice waiting for a panicked old man. When we were finished, Mike handed me a tablet. The screen displayed a split view of my home in crisp, terrifying detail. The night vision turned the backyard into a ghostly green landscape while the interior shots were sharp and bright. I stared at the screen. My living room looked like a movie set waiting for the actors to arrive. "This wraps to a cloud server," Mike explained, tapping the screen. "Even if they find the cameras and smash them, the footage is already gone. It is secure." I looked at the empty armchair on the screen. I imagined Travis walking into that frame. I imagined the look on Courtney's face when she realized there was no body to cry over. I was not just setting a trap for a criminal. I was preparing to capture the death of a relationship. I was going to record the exact moment my son realized he had not just lost his father, but his fortune. We sat in the dark watching the feeds. The stage was set. The lighting was perfect. Now we just needed the villains to make their entrance. I placed the tablet on the desk next to the unsigned trust documents. Let them come, I thought. I am ready for my close-up. The side door to the garage opened with a gust of wind, and Andrew Hartman stepped into the mudroom, shaking the snow from his cashmere coat. He looked pale. Andrew had been my attorney for 30 years, and he had seen me through business mergers and market crashes. But he had never looked at me with the expression he wore tonight. It was a mix of pity and horror. He did not offer a handshake. He simply gripped his leather briefcase tighter, as if it contained a bomb. We did not go to the study. We sat right there at the kitchen island, the same slab of granite, where Travis had eaten his cereal every morning before school, the same spot where he had sat just 24 hours ago, lying to my face. The house was quiet now, save for the scratching of Andrew's pen as he finalized the dates on the documents. "These are the trust papers," Doug Andrew said, his voice low and professional, though I could hear the tremor in it. "Once you sign these, there is no going back. The transfer is immediate and irrevocable. The house, the investment portfolio, the offshore accounts, and the life insurance policy. Everything moves into the control of the trust." I nodded. I did not hesitate. I watched as he slid the paper toward me. The name of the trust was printed in bold letters at the top. The Vera Kowalski Living Trust. Andrew had asked me on the phone if I was sure. He had asked if Vera was a relative or a secret lover. I told him she was just a neighbor who saw what I was too blind to see. Vera had lived in a freezing apartment, eating cat food while saving my life. She would never have to worry about a heating bill again. She would never have to count pennies at the grocery store. I was taking the empire my son tried to steal and giving it to the woman who actually deserved it. Then we reached the final page, the section for specific bequests. This was usually where family heirlooms and sentimental items were distributed. Andrew looked at me, his pen hovering over the blank space. "And for Travis?" he asked. His voice was cold. "Usually in these cases we leave a token amount. $1. It proves you did not forget him. It prevents him from contesting the will by claiming you were not of sound mind." I shook my head. $1 is too generous, Andrew, and it is too impersonal. I want to leave him something that he will understand, something that carries a message. I reached across the table and took the pen from his hand. The ink was black and permanent. I wrote slowly, my hand steady and sure. "To my son Travis," I wrote, "I leave my heavy-duty aluminum snow shovel. It is in the garage." I paused, looking at the words. Then I added one final line underneath. "Use it to dig your own way out of the hole you are in." I signed my name at the bottom, Douglas Bennett, with a flourish I had not used in years. It was done. I had just disinherited my only child. I had stripped him of the millions he thought were his birthright, and left him with nothing but a tool for manual labor. Andrew took the document and placed it in his bag. He looked at me, and for the first time that night, he smiled. It was a grim smile, but it was there. "I will file this first thing in the morning," Andrew said. "By the time he lands in Chicago, he will be a pauper." I walked him to the door. The trap was set. The bait was laid. And now the paperwork was signed. All that was left to do was wait for the wolf to come home and realize he had walked into a cage. The warmth returned to the house, slowly creeping into the corners that the frost had claimed, but it could not reach the chill that had settled in the marrow of my bones. Mike had left hours ago after securing the perimeter, and the furnace was now humming a steady, rhythmic song of safety. It was 72 degrees up in the living room, the perfect temperature for a lazy Sunday afternoon. But I sat in my leather wingback chair, wrapped in a blanket, shivering with a nausea that had nothing to do with the flu. I stared at the grandfather clock in the corner. The pendulum swung back and forth with a hypnotic indifference. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Each second was another grain of sand falling through the hourglass of my son's freedom. I had spent the last 24 hours in a state of adrenaline-fueled action, solving problems and gathering evidence like the engineer I was trained to be. But now, with the trap set and the lawyers working and the cameras recording, there was nothing left to do but wait. And in the waiting, the ghosts came out. My eyes drifted to the mantel above the fireplace. There, in a silver frame, was a photo of Travis at 5 years old. We were at the lake house. He was holding a fish. He had just caught a tiny sunfish that looked like a trophy in his small hands. He was beaming, looking up at me with a reverence that only a son can have for his father. I remembered that day vividly. I remembered how he had scraped his knee on the dock, and how I had scooped him up and carried him all the way back to the cabin. I remembered the weight of his small head resting on my shoulder, his absolute trust that I would make the pain go away. I looked at that smiling boy, and I felt a physical bile rise in my throat. I tried to reconcile that child with the man who had stood in this very room yesterday and lied to my face. How does a boy who used to cry when he stepped on a bug grow up to be a man who can calmly calculate the lethal dosage of carbon monoxide needed to kill his own father? Where did the rot begin? Was it the private schools? Was it the cars I bought him? Or was there always some darkness in him, a structural flaw in his soul that I was too loving to see? I thought about the shovel I had left for him in the will. I thought about the black ice on the walkway. The cruelty of it was what shattered me. He didn't just want me dead. He wanted me to suffer. He wanted me to be afraid and confused in my final moments. He wanted to erase 40 years of love for a payout that wouldn't even last him a year. I looked back at the clock. The afternoon light was fading, turning the snow outside into a sea of blue shadows. I realized then that I wasn't just waiting for a criminal to return to the scene of the crime. I was holding a wake. I was mourning the death of the boy in the photograph. That boy died a long time ago, and the thing coming home from Aspen was just a hollow shell filled with greed. I closed my eyes and let the tears finally come hot and angry. I cried for the 5-year-old on the dock because he deserved a better legacy than the monster he became. When I opened my eyes, the tears were gone. The father was gone. Only the executioner remained. The sun had long since surrendered to the horizon, and the streetlights flickered on, casting long orange shadows across the snow-packed neighborhood. The silence that settled over the street was heavy and deliberate. To the casual observer, it looked like just another quiet Sunday night in an affluent suburb, but I knew better. I knew that the darkness was filled with eyes. Andrew had been true to his word. He had not just filed the paperwork, he had made the call that turns a domestic dispute into a tactical operation. He had contacted Chief Miller personally. Miller was a man of the old school, a veteran officer with gray at his temples and eyes that had seen every variety of human cruelty. He and I had served on the charity board together years ago. He knew my character, and more importantly, he knew a solid case when he saw one. He did not send patrol cars with flashing lights. There were no sirens wailing to warn the predators that the trap was shut. Instead, they arrived like ghosts. Unmarked sedans and black SUVs gliding silently onto the pavement, parking 2 blocks away in the shadows of the large oak trees that lined the avenue. They were far enough away that Travis would not notice them when he drove in, but close enough to close the net the moment the signal was given. My phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from Andrew simply stating they are in position. I peeked through the slats of the blinds in the living room. I couldn't see them, which was the point, but I felt their presence. It was a strange comfort, knowing that heavily armed men were waiting in the freezing cold just to protect an old man from his own flesh and blood. Miller had explained the strategy to Andrew, and Andrew had relayed it to me. It was a game of patience. If they arrested Travis the moment his car pulled into the driveway, a good defense attorney could argue that he knew nothing about the blocked vent or the ice. He could claim he was just coming home from a vacation. We needed behavior that proved guilt. We needed the actus reus, as the lawyers called it. The plan was brutal in its simplicity. We would let them enter the house. We would let them walk past the thermostat. We would let them walk into the living room where they expected to find my body. And then we would wait. The police would be listening on the audio feed from the cameras we installed. They were waiting for one specific thing. They were waiting for the absence of a 911 call. If a son comes home and finds his father unconscious or dead, his first instinct should be to scream for help, to call an ambulance, to try CPR. But if Travis walked in, checked my pulse, and then started celebrating, or worse, started staging the scene to look like an accident, then the handcuffs would come out. They were waiting to charge him with failure to render aid and tampering with a crime scene. These were the immediate charges that would stick while the attempted murder investigation was built. I imagined Miller sitting in his command car, sipping cold coffee, watching the monitors. I wondered what he thought of a father entrapping his son. I wondered if he felt pity for me. But as I looked at the empty street, I realized I didn't want pity. I wanted justice. The stage was set, the audience was seated in their unmarked cars, and the actors were on their way. All that was left was for the curtain to rise on the tragedy they had written for themselves. The aroma of sage and roasted thyme began to drift through the hallways, masking the lingering metallic scent of the earlier fear. It was a smell that usually signaled Thanksgiving or Christmas, the scent of family gathering and gratitude. But tonight, it was the scent of a trap. I had placed a 20-pound turkey in the oven 3 hours ago. It was a grotesque pantomime of a holiday dinner, a domestic ritual performed in the middle of a tactical operation, but I found a strange comfort in the routine. Basting the bird, peeling the potatoes, and chopping the vegetables kept my hands busy and my mind from eating itself alive. I moved to the formal dining room, the space that had not been used since Elizabeth's wake. I switched on the chandelier, and the crystal prisms caught the light, scattering rainbows across the mahogany table. I opened the china cabinet and took out the good plates, the Spode porcelain, with the intricate blue floral patterns that Elizabeth had loved so much. I handled them with reverence, wiping a speck of dust from the rim of a saucer. I set 4 places. The first setting was for me, the survivor, the man who refused to go gently into that dark night. The second was for Andrew Hartman, my attorney, the architect of the legal cage that was about to snap shut. He would need a hot meal after filing the paperwork that dismantled my son's future. The third was for Mike, the witness, who had braved the gas chamber to document the truth. He deserved a feast for his loyalty. And the fourth setting was for Chief Miller. He was currently sitting in a cold, unmarked car 2 blocks away, but once the handcuffs were on and the suspect was processed, I wanted to shake his hand and offer him a drumstick. It was a gathering of the men who stood by me when my own blood turned against me. I did not set a place for Travis. I did not set a place for Courtney. I placed the heavy silver forks and knives on the table, aligning them with the precision of a draftsman. I folded the linen napkins into crisp triangles. I brought out the crystal wine glasses. It looked inviting. It looked warm. It looked like a home. Travis was expecting to walk into a frozen mausoleum. He was expecting to find his father curled up and cold in a dark house. He was expecting the silence of the grave. Instead, he would walk into a house that smelled of roasting meat and safety. He would see a table set for a celebration he was not invited to. The cognitive dissonance would paralyze him. It would shatter the narrative he had built in his head. I went back to the kitchen and opened the oven door. A blast of heat hit my face. The turkey was golden brown, the skin crisp and glistening. It was perfect. It was the last supper of his freedom, but he wouldn't get a single bite. I turned off the oven, but left the bird inside to stay warm. The centerpiece was ready. The guests were waiting in the wings. I poured myself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, watching the steam rise. The table was set. Now I just needed the main course to drive up the driveway. I moved through the house with the solemnity of an undertaker closing up for the night. The crystal chandelier in the dining room went dark first, plunging the table I had set with such care into shadow. Then I extinguished the under-cabinet lights in the kitchen, hiding the remnants of the preparation. Room by room, I erased the warmth and the life until the house felt vast and hollow again. It was a necessary theater. If Travis walked into a brightly lit home, he would know instantly that his plan had failed. He needed to walk into the silence he had manufactured. I stood in the center of the living room. The only source of light came from the fireplace where I had turned the gas logs down to their lowest setting. It was not a cheerful, roaring fire. It was a weak, dying ember casting long, dancing shadows that stretched across the floor like grasping fingers. The faint orange glow barely illuminated the leather armchair where he expected to find my body. It was enough to see a shape, but not enough to see the rise and fall of a chest. It was perfect. I retreated into the shadows of the hallway near the study door. This was my vantage point. From here I was invisible, but I had a clear line of sight to the front foyer and the living room entrance. I stood perfectly still, controlling my breathing, letting my eyes adjust to the gloom. The smell of the roasting turkey still hung in the air, a ghostly scent of celebration that felt jarring in the dark, but it would only add to his confusion. Then I saw it. Two beams of bright halogen light swept across the ceiling, slicing through the darkness like a prison searchlight. They tracked across the crown molding, illuminating the dust motes, dancing in the air, before vanishing as the vehicle turned. The vibration of a heavy engine hummed through the floorboards. It was a sound I knew well. The low, aggressive purr of the Mercedes SUV I had leased for him 2 years ago. He was here. I heard the crunch of tires compacting the fresh snow in the driveway. He was parking close to the garage, probably to unload the luggage, or perhaps to make a quick getaway if things went wrong. The engine cut off, and the sudden silence outside was louder than the wind. I could imagine them sitting there for a moment. Were they gathering their courage, rehearsing their lines, or were they just checking the time to make sure enough hours had passed for the gas to do its work? My heart hammered against my ribs, a slow, heavy drumbeat. This was not the nervous flutter of fear. It was the adrenaline of the hunt. I gripped the doorframe, my knuckles white in the gloom. I listened to the car doors slam shut. Thud. Thud. Two distinct sounds. They were both here. They were walking toward the front door, their boots crunching on the walkway. The key turned in the lock with a metallic scrape that echoed through the silent house. The handle turned. The door began to open, pushing a wedge of cold, snowy wind into the dark foyer. The curtain was rising. The actors had taken the stage. The heavy oak door remained shut. I stood in the darkness of the hallway watching the live feed on the tablet Mike had left me. The screen glowed with the crisp, high-definition, black and white imagery from the night vision camera mounted above the garage. What I saw on that small screen made my stomach turn with a nausea that had nothing to do with the gas they thought had killed me. Travis and Courtney had exited the vehicle, but they were not rushing toward the house. If they truly believed I was in danger, if they were truly the worried children checking on an ailing father during a storm, they would have been sprinting across the snow. They would be banging on the door screaming my name. They would be fumbling with keys in a panic. Instead, they were standing by the hood of the Mercedes casually, as if they were waiting for a table at a restaurant. Travis reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a pack of cigarettes. He cupped his hands against the wind and lit one, the sudden flare of the lighter illuminating his face in a harsh, brief flash. He took a long drag and exhaled a cloud of smoke that mixed with the steam of his breath. He looked calm. He looked like a man who had just finished a long shift and was taking a moment before clocking out. Courtney was busy with her own preparations. She placed her expensive handbag on the hood of the car, a spot free of snow. She opened it and began rummaging through the contents. I watched as she pulled out a small mirror and checked her reflection. She adjusted her scarf, pulling it slightly askew to look less put together, less perfect. She messed up her hair just a fraction, tugging a few strands loose so they would frame her face in a semblance of distress. Then she did something that froze the blood in my veins. She reached back into the bag and produced a small plastic bottle. Even on the monochrome screen, I recognized the shape. Eye drops, Vicine or some generic equivalent. She tilted her head back, opening her eyes wide to the falling snow. She squeezed the bottle. 1 drop, 2 drops. She blinked rapidly, forcing the liquid to run down her cheeks. She turned to Travis and said something. He looked at her and nodded, offering a small, tight smile of approval. She was manufacturing tears. She was painting on her grief like makeup, preparing the mask she would wear for the police and the coroner. It was a masterclass in deception. They were rehearsing the scene before the curtain went up. Travis flicked his cigarette butt into the snow, watching the embers die out. He buttoned his coat all the way to the top, hiding the expensive sweater underneath, perhaps trying to look more somber. He took a deep breath, visibly centering himself, stepping into character. They exchanged one last look. It wasn't a look of love or shared sorrow. It was the look of accomplices checking their gear before a heist. Courtney wiped the excess liquid from her chin, leaving just enough to look like fresh tear tracks. She reached out and took Travis's hand. The gesture looked practiced. They turned toward the house. They began to walk up the driveway, their pace slow and deliberate. They were ready to find a body. They were ready to scream and cry and play the part of the devastated survivors. I lowered the tablet and stepped back into the shadows of the study. My heart was pounding, but my hands were steady. You want a tragedy, I thought, as I watched the front doorknob begin to turn. I will give you a tragedy, but it will not be the one you wrote. The handle turned, but that was not dramatic enough for the audience they thought they were playing to. Instead of simply unlocking the door like a civilized human being returning home, Travis decided to stage an entrance worthy of an action movie. There was a violent crash as his boot slammed against the wood near the deadbolt. The door flew open, bouncing off the interior wall with a crack that echoed like a gunshot through the silent house. It was pure theater. He wanted the police to see the splintered jam later. He wanted them to see the physical evidence of his desperate panic, his frantic need to save the father he had already condemned. Cold air rushed into the foyer, followed immediately by his voice. "Dad!" he bellowed. It was a loud, guttural roar projected from the diaphragm, designed to carry across the street to where he hoped the neighbors were listening. "Dad, answer me." Courtney followed close behind him, her voice pitched into a shrill, hysterical frequency. "Oh my God, Travis! Is he okay? Doug! Doug!" It was a cacophony of manufactured terror. To anyone outside, it sounded like a family in crisis. To me, standing 10 feet away in the pitch-black hallway, it sounded like a rehearsal for a bad soap opera. Travis did not stop at the switch plate by the door. A normal person worried about a family member in a dark house would flood the room with light immediately to assess the situation. You turn on the lights so you don't trip. You turn on the lights to see if there is blood or if the person is breathing. But Travis did not reach for the dimmer. He did not fumble for the lamp on the console table. He moved with a terrifying predatory purpose through the gloom. He knew exactly where he was going. He bypassed the coat rack, he bypassed the stairs. He made a beeline for the living room, his heavy boots thudding against the hardwood floor. He was drawn like a moth to a flame toward the faint orange glow of the fireplace. He was fixated on the wingback chair. The high leather back faced the entry, casting a long shadow that obscured the seat. In his mind, the script was already written. He expected to round that corner and find me slumped over my skin, cherry red from the carbon monoxide my chest still. "Dad!" He screamed again, throwing himself toward the chair, his hands reaching out to grab the shoulders of the dead man he had created. He was ready to shake me to perform the desperate CPR that he knew would be useless. He was ready to cry over my body, to wail and gnash his teeth. He rushed into that room with the momentum of a freight train, completely blind to everything except his own dark expectation. He did not smell the turkey. He did not see the cameras. He only saw the destination of his greed. He reached the chair and grabbed the leather, ready to start the show, but his hands grasped nothing but empty air. Travis gripped the cold leather of the armchair, his fingers digging into the material, but finding no resistance. There was no weight in the seat, no slumped figure, no corpse. He stumbled back, his boots scuffing against the Persian rug, his theatrical scream dying in his throat, replaced by a confused whimper. Courtney stood behind him, her fake sobbing cutting off abruptly like a radio being unplugged. They spun around in the darkness, their eyes darting wildly, scanning the floor, expecting to find me collapsed on the carpet. "Dad," Travis whispered again, but this time there was no performance in it, only a creeping, terrified confusion. "Where are you?" Then I hit the switch. The world turned white. Every light in the house, the crystal chandelier in the dining room, the recessed cans in the hallway, and the sconces on the walls blazed to life simultaneously. It was blinding. Travis threw his hands up to shield his eyes, blinking rapidly against the sudden assault of brilliance. Courtney let out a small shriek of surprise, stumbling back against the wall. As their vision cleared, the scene before them came into sharp, terrifying focus. They were not standing in a tomb. They were standing at the edge of a banquet. I stood at the head of the long mahogany dining table. In my right hand I held the long silver carving knife, its blade gleaming dangerously under the lights. In my left I held the heavy serving fork. I was not gasping for air. I was not blue in the face. I was wearing my best charcoal suit, a linen napkin tucked neatly into my collar, looking the picture of health and vitality. But the real shock was the company I kept. To my right sat Andrew Hartman, my attorney, sipping a glass of the vintage Cabernet that Travis had coveted the night before. To my left sat Mike, looking grim and satisfied, his arms crossed over his chest. And at the foot of the table, directly facing the intruders, sat Chief Miller. The chief was calmly wiping grease from his lip with a linen napkin, his service weapon visible in the shoulder holster beneath his unbuttoned jacket. The silence in the room was absolute. It was heavy and suffocating. Travis stood frozen in the archway, his mouth hanging open, a perfect circle of shock. The Vizine tears were still wet on Courtney's cheeks, glistening under the harsh lights, marking her as the fraud she was. They looked small. They looked cheap. The powerful narrative they had written, the tragic accident, the grieving children, the inheritance disintegrated in the face of a roasted turkey and a room full of witnesses. I sliced a piece of white meat from the bird, the knife slicing through the crisp skin with a sound that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. I did not look up immediately. I let the tension stretch until it was thin and brittle, ready to snap. I placed the slice of meat on a plate. Then I raised my eyes. I looked right at him. I looked at the son who had watered my walkway and plugged my furnace. "You are back early, son," I said, my voice conversational, polite, and absolutely deadly. "I did not think you would be coming to collect the body until tomorrow morning." Travis stood paralyzed in the archway, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from the water. The script in his head had been burned to ash, and he was scrambling to find a new line to speak. He looked at the roast turkey, then at the police chief, then finally at me. He tried to summon the mask of the concerned son again, but the muscles in his face refused to cooperate. He took a half step forward, his hands trembling, reaching out as if to touch a ghost. "Dad," he stammered, his voice cracking. "I do not understand. We called. You sounded so sick. We drove straight here." He was still lying. Even with the noose tightening around his neck, he was trying to bluff his way out. Courtney was not as committed to the performance. The color had drained from her face, leaving the artificial tears to dry on pale skin. She looked at Mike, who was holding the video camera steady, recording their every twitch. She looked at Andrew, who was staring at her with the cold, clinical detachment of a prosecutor. The reality of the situation crashed down on her. Her hands, which had been clutching the strap of her purse, turned slack. The bright orange Hermes Birkin bag, the symbol of the wealth she was so desperate to steal, slipped from her numb fingers. It hit the hardwood floor with a heavy, expensive thud. The sound was final, like a gavel striking a block. Andrew Hartman did not say a word. He simply stood up from the table, his movements calm and deliberate. He picked up a small black remote control and pointed it at the 60-inch television mounted above the fireplace, the very screen Travis had bought me for Christmas 2 years ago using my own credit card. Andrew pressed a button. The screen flared to life. The image was crisp and undeniable. It was a high-resolution photograph taken in the stark light of a camera flash. It showed the side of my house. It showed the white PVC intake pipe. And wedged firmly inside the opening was the jagged square of plywood. The view zoomed in, showing the saw marks on the wood, showing the way the snow had been carefully packed around it to hide the crime. Travis made a sound low in his throat, a strangled whimper of denial. He took a step back, bumping into Courtney. Andrew pressed the button again. The image changed. Now it was a video, grainy and gray, taken from a dashboard across the alley. The angle was wide, but the figures were unmistakable. Travis and Courtney standing in the snow, their breath pluming in the air. Then came the sound. The audio was amplified, filling the living room with crystal-clear fidelity. Courtney's voice rang out sharp and greedy, asking about the insurance timeline. Then Travis's voice, calm and calculating, explaining the double indemnity clause, explaining how the carbon monoxide combined with the ice would make it look like a tragic accident. "I did the math," the voice on the recording said. "The levels will hit lethal toxicity by 3 a.m. In the living room, the real Travis squeezed his eyes shut, as if closing them could stop the sound of his own guilt. The recording played on, detailing the plan to pay off the gambling debts with my death benefit. Every word was a confession. Every sentence was a nail in his coffin. I watched him crumble. The arrogance was gone. The entitlement was gone. He wasn't a mastermind anymore. He was just a boy who had made a terrible bet and lost everything. The video ended, leaving a frozen image of the two of them conspiring in the snow looming over the silent room. I set down my carving knife. The trial was over. The verdict was in. The silence that followed the video was shattered by a sound that was pure animal instinct. It was the sound of a trapped rat realizing there is no hole in the wall. Travis looked at the screen where his own voice was still echoing the details of his crime, and then he looked at me. The logic in his eyes evaporated. The calculation that had defined him for the last 48 hours was replaced by a blind, white-hot panic. He realized that the police chief was sitting between him and the door. He realized that the lawyer held the papers that stripped him of his fortune. He realized that his life as he knew it was over. His eyes locked onto the silver carving knife resting on the cutting board near my hand. It was a desperate, irrational thought. But in that split second, it was the only thought he had. If he could get the weapon, if he could take a hostage, if he could just silence the man who had outsmarted him, maybe he could survive. He roared a guttural, shapeless sound of rage and lunged forward. He moved with the explosive speed of a younger man, launching himself across the dining room floor, his hands clawed and reaching for my throat. Courtney screamed a high, piercing sound and scrambled backward, knocking over a chair. Chief Miller began to rise, his hand moving to his holster, but he did not need to draw his weapon. The house itself decided to intervene. Travis had forgotten the snow on his boots. He had forgotten that he had just walked in from a blizzard carrying the winter in with him. And he had forgotten that, unlike him, I took care of this house. The hardwood floors of the dining room had been freshly waxed just yesterday, polished to a mirror shine that I took great pride in. When his heavy, wet boot hit the slick mahogany surface, physics took over. There was a loud squeak of rubber losing its grip, followed instantly by the flailing of limbs. His legs shot out from under him as if they had been swept by an invisible scythe. For a moment, he was suspended in the air, his face contorted in shock, his arms windmilling uselessly. The momentum of his charge turned against him, driving him downward with brutal force. He hit the floor hard. His head cracked against the wood, with a sickening thud that vibrated through the room. It was not a lethal blow, but it was enough. The fight went out of him instantly. He lay there, sprawled on his back, his eyes unfocused, groaning low in his throat. The wind was knocked out of him, and the room was spinning. He tried to push himself up, but his arms were like jelly, and he collapsed back onto the floor, defeated by his own aggression. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply looked down at him over the rim of my glasses. The carving knife lay untouched on the table beside me. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. He had spent days engineering a slip and fall accident for me. He had watered the concrete, hoping I would break my neck on the ice. And here he was, lying at my feet, brought low by a slippery floor. I picked up the linen napkin and calmly wiped a speck of grease from my finger. I looked down at my son, who was blinking up at the ceiling, trying to remember where he was. "Careful there, son," I said, my voice dry and devoid of sympathy. "I have been telling you for years to take your boots off at the door. You really should watch your step. The floor is slippery when wet." The sound of handcuffs ratcheting tight is a distinct metallic click that cuts through any other noise in a room. It is the sound of finality. It is the mechanical period at the end of a sentence. Chief Miller did not hesitate. He knelt beside my son, his knee pressing firmly into Travis's back, pinning him to the floor he had just waxed with his own ambition. Travis tried to struggle weakly, but the wind had been knocked out of him and the fight was gone. Miller pulled Travis's arms behind his back and secured the steel cuffs with a practiced efficiency. "Travis Bennett, you are under arrest," Miller said, his voice calm and authoritative, filling the dining room. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree. Attempted murder. Insurance fraud. Each charge was a hammer blow, driving the reality of his situation deeper into his skull. Travis groaned, pressing his cheek against the cold wood, closing his eyes as if he could shut out the nightmare he had created. But the real explosion came from the corner of the room. Courtney watched the metal cuffs lock around her husband's wrists, and something inside her broke. The mask of the grieving daughter-in-law vanished completely, replaced by the feral panic of a cornered animal. She saw the second pair of handcuffs in the hands of a uniformed officer who had just entered from the kitchen, and she began to scream. "No," she shrieked, backing away until she hit the china cabinet, causing the crystal glasses inside to rattle. "You cannot arrest me. I did not do anything. I am a victim here." She pointed a trembling manicured finger at the man lying prone on the floor. It was him, she yelled, her voice shrill and piercing. He made me do it. I told him it was crazy. I told him I did not want to be involved. He forced me. He said he would hurt me if I did not go along with it. I am innocent. Please, you have to believe me. Travis lifted his head from the floor. The daze from the concussion was clearing, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. He looked at the woman he had planned a life with, the woman he had been willing to kill his own father to please. There was no love left in his eyes, only the cold, bitter realization that he had been played. You lying witch, he rasped, spitting the words out. It was your idea. You were the one who found the loan shark. You were the one who looked up the insurance policy. Do not try to pin this on me. They turned on each other instantly. The alliance built on greed crumbled the moment the pressure was applied. They shouted accusations back and forth, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of betrayal. It was pathetic. It was ugly. And it was exactly what they deserved. The officers moved in, separating them, grabbing Courtney's arms as she kicked and sobbed, trying to fight them off. They dragged her toward the door, her heels leaving scuff marks on the floor. Travis was hauled to his feet, his head hanging low, unable to look me in the eye. I stood by the table, my hand resting on the back of the chair, and watched them go. The house was chaotic and loud, but as the door closed behind them, a profound silence began to return. The poison was finally leaving the building. The snow was finally receding. The white drifts that had entombed the neighborhood for the last week were turning into slush and running into the gutters, carrying away the grime of the city. The sun was out, bright and unobscured by clouds, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. It was a crisp, clear morning, the kind that hurts your lungs with its purity, but I did not mind the cold today. I knew it was the last time I would feel it for a long while. I stood on the rickety wooden porch of the garage apartment across the alley. I knocked on the peeling paint of the door. Vera opened it almost immediately. She was still wearing that heavy wool shawl wrapped tight around her frail shoulders, a habit born of years of rationing heat. She looked at me with those sharp, bird-like eyes that missed nothing. She saw the suitcase in my hand. She saw the lightness in my step. I did not say a word at first. I simply held out a thick manila envelope. She took it hesitantly, her rough hands brushing against the smooth paper. "What is this, Douglas?" she asked, her voice raspy. "It is the deed to this building, Vera," I said softly. "I bought it this morning. You are not the tenant anymore. You are the landlady. You can turn the heat up as high as you want. You can fix the windows. You can paint the door any color you like." She stared at the papers, her mouth slightly open. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a second envelope, smaller this time. "And this is the access code to the trust fund I set up in your name. You never have to eat cat food again. You never have to worry about the electric bill. You saved my life, Vera. This is the least I can do to make sure the rest of yours is comfortable." For a moment, she stood frozen. Then the tears came, not the fake Vizine tears of a greedy daughter-in-law, but the hot, honest tears of a woman who had been invisible for too long. She dropped the envelopes and pulled me into a hug. She was small and frail, but her grip was strong. I held her for a long moment, feeling the genuine warmth of a friend. We did not need to say goodbye. We both knew that some bonds are forged in fire and ice, and they do not break with distance. I walked back to my truck. It was packed high with the few things I cared to keep. My camera, my books, the few photos of Elizabeth that were not tainted by Travis's presence. I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The GPS on the dashboard was already programmed. Destination, Key West, Florida. Distance 1,400 miles. I put the truck in gear, but before I pulled away, I looked in the rearview mirror one last time. I looked at the big brick colonial house standing proud against the blue sky. The for sale sign planted in the front yard was already gathering interest. It was a magnificent structure, a testament to my career and my success. But as I looked at it, I realized it was just bricks and mortar. It was just a building where I used to live. The ghosts that had haunted its halls, the betrayal and the heartache, had been exorcised. I felt no sadness, no lingering regret. I felt only the immense relief of a survivor walking out of a collapsed mine. I turned the wheel and pulled out onto the main road, leaving the cul-de-sac behind. The heater in the truck kicked on, blowing warm air against my face. I rolled down the window and let the cold wind hit me one last time, savoring the bite of it, knowing I was driving toward the sun. The winter of my life was officially over. I pressed the accelerator, watching the snow-covered streets fade into the distance. It was time to go find my spring. The most profound lesson from Douglas Bennett's journey is that family is defined by integrity and action, not by DNA. We often cling to the people we love, refusing to see their darkness until it is too late, but true loyalty is found in those who protect us when we are vulnerable, like Vera, not those who prey on our weakness, like Travis. Doug proved that age is not a deficit, but a vast repository of wisdom and strength. He showed us that it is never too late to cut out the toxicity that poisons your soul and to drive toward a warmer, brighter future where respect is earned and love is genuine. If you enjoyed this story of justice and survival, hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more gripping tales.